Hi guys, this is a lecture on the early Republic and the Federalist era in 1789 to 1800. So this includes George Washington's first presidency, as well as the emergence of political parties. So first we have to take a look at what America was like in 1790. So this is on page 1. So as I'm going through the lecture, just fill in the information that is blank in your packet with the information that reflects in the presentation. So in America in 1790, the population was nearly 4 million. So it doubled every 25 years. 90% of Americans lived on farms. There was a public debt that was extremely large. So you had $52 million. The reason for that public debt, again, was partly because we spent a ton of money in the American Revolutionary War, and we probably were owing some of that debt back to the countries that assisted us, including France. And we weren't generating any revenue. Being a young country, we didn't have a lot of ways to generate money in order to pay off that $52 million debt. We also were incurring threats from Great Britain and Spain, which, again, being a young country, threatens the fragility and unity of the United States. So if anything major happens, our country could be sabotaged depending on the conflict. So we were incurring a lot of threats, and again, we were very fragile and very new country. So take a moment and fill in A, B, C, and D on page 1 of slide number A, or letter A. You can pause the video if you need to. All right, so with Washington's presidency, if you flip to page 2, the top slide talks about his election. So with his election, he was unanimously elected by the states that were established at this time in 1789 and elected by the Electoral College. He took the oath of office on April 30th, 1789, and at this time we didn't have our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. It was actually established in New York City. But later, eventually, it will be with the creation of Washington, D.C., be moved. And since John Adams received the second highest amount of votes, he was elected vice president. So take a moment, pause the video at this time. All right, so the second one on page 2 talks about Washington's cabinet. So the Constitution did not provide for the offices of the cabinet, and the cabinet was shaped with the ideological feuding between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. So just a little bit of background information. Again, Thomas Jefferson was very along the lines of the anti-Federalists. He emphasized state control. He was a Southern plantation owner, and Alexander Hamilton was completely the opposite. He was very more national government, national control, or national checks in terms of making sure that states were doing what they needed to do. So they very much clashed, and oftentimes Washington was kind of in the middle of the situation. So next week, as we talk a little bit more about the ideological differences between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, those of you who have seen the musical Hamilton, you should know that they had some very famous cabinet battles that occurred. So with those two people and their ideologies, they came up with the first 4 cabinet offices of Washington's presidency. So first was a Secretary of State, which was given to Thomas Jefferson. So the Secretary of State is a person that does diplomatic relations or keeps diplomatic relations with countries outside of the United States. Thomas Jefferson had a great relationship with France, so that assisted us as well. The Secretary of Treasury naturally was given to Alexander Hamilton. He was the creator of our national banking system, and he had an eye for finance. So he handled a way to, or came up with a way to alleviate some of the financial issues that existed. The third office was the Secretary of War, which is the head of our military, Henry Knox. So Henry Knox would be the one that Washington would refer to if there were questions or to give advice about military situations that were occurring. And the last was the Attorney General's office. Now, this Attorney General's office wasn't passed or opened until after the Judiciary Act of 1789. And the Attorney General basically goes over the legality of certain things regarding the executive office. So again, these four were the first four offices of the presidency or the executive branch in the United States. So you can take a moment and fill in part B of number 2. All right, so I apologize since these are kind of out of order in the way that they're organized in your packet, but if you could flip to page 4, we've talked a lot about the Bill of Rights, and it was also in Liberty, Are We to Be a Nation? So again, to reiterate, the first priority of this new government was including the Bill of Rights as part of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were really stringent on wanting these included because they didn't want national government's power to overreach or become too powerful. So they sharply criticized the Constitution for not including these rights that we are guaranteed as citizens of the United States. The Federalists, on the other hand, saw the Bill of Rights as unnecessary. So the viewpoint that they had was that since we had the separation of powers and a system of checks and balances of the three branches of government, that those inherently should take care of protecting the rights of our citizens. So they viewed it as unnecessary to have these explicit Bill of Rights listed. So James Madison, little 5'1" James Madison, drafts and submits 12 amendments to Congress to be reviewed. This was actually based on George Mason's Bill of Rights from the state of Virginia. So 10 of these 12 were passed. So again, the first one was our basic rights of freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. All of those were included in Article 1. Article 2 is the right to bear arms. Article 3, no quartering troops during peacetime, so not requiring citizens to house and feed soldiers in a time of peace. Article 4, no unlawful search or seizure can occur. So if a police officer pulls you over and wants to search your car, they need a warrant necessary if there is no probable cause given to the police. So they must have a warrant unless they have probable cause. Article 5, rights of accused persons. Article 6, the right to an attorney in a trial by jury. So when you read your Miranda rights, which was actually a court case that was included in order for police to have to read your Miranda rights, you have the right to an attorney, you have the right to a trial by jury. Article 7, civil suits that are over $20 get a jury trial. Article 8, no cruel and unusual punishment or excessive bail. So we talked about that one in the power grab game with the hijackers and the fingernails tearing off. So Guantanamo Bay, one of the issues there was the usage of cruel and unusual punishment as well. So is that warranted or can we do that? So that is covered under Article 8. Article 9, citizens have more rights than are listed explicitly within the 10 amendments of the Constitution. And Article 10, rights are reserved by the state. So please take a moment and fill in part A and B if you haven't already under number 1. All right, so next we'll talk about Hamilton's financial plan. So being the great mind that he was in terms of trying to take care of this national debt and what our debt actually looked like and combining those state debts into a national debt, Hamilton came up with a 5-point plan. So number 1, or A, was the funding at par. So funding at par means that we'll borrow money from other countries, where it be, and promise to pay that money back, plus interest to help us with that national debt. So we not only pay the money back that we took, but we'd also pay interest depending on how long that debt existed to whoever we were borrowing from. B is the assumption of state debts. So again, the idea was to pool all of those state debts. So as you can see the list on the upper left-hand corner, you have all the 13 states that exist. All the debts they accrue or acquire are placed into just one national debt. And C is to include tariffs. So tariffs are a tax on imports. So anything that comes from outside the United States into the United States and get shipped into the United States, we tax those imports to raise money, to raise revenue, and also to protect United States businesses from shelling out all this money to get things shipped back and forth. So that not only protects businesses, but it also creates revenue for our country to pay off national debt. D is an excise tax on whiskey. So this will become an issue of contention with a lot of the whiskey farmers or people who developed and distilled whiskey in Pennsylvania. But there was a 7-cent tax on whiskey. And then the last part was creation of a national bank. Now, the Federalists believed in a loose constructionism viewpoint, meaning that the powers were not delegated to the national government in the Constitution. Any power not delegated to the national government are not prohibited by the virtue of necessary and proper clause. So this was called the loose constructionism viewpoint, and this is where they get the idea of the elastic clause from. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were strongly opposed to this, and they were called the strict constructionist viewpoints. So George Washington, knowing that there was opposition from the Anti-Federalists, actually erred on the side of Alexander Hamilton and signed this 5-point bank measure into law in February 1791 as a way to alleviate some of the debt that we were incurring. So take a moment and fill in A, B, C, D, and E under Hamilton's financial plan. All right, so flipping over to page 5, this one talks about the Whiskey Rebellion. So kind of going back to that excise tax, 7-cent tax on whiskey, a lot of those southwestern Pennsylvania people who distilled whiskey were hit very hard by the excise tax. So in their production, they had to pay a 7-cent tax on the whiskey that they were creating. So a group known as the Whiskey Boys started torching buildings, tarred and feathered tax collectors who were coming to collect these excise taxes. And they also talked of Pennsylvania actually succeeding from the 13 states and becoming its own individual country. And this isn't going to be the first time that this will actually happen, but a number of states will actually do this, as you know, or hopefully are aware of within the Civil War, which we'll talk about later on. So George Washington summoned his militia of several states. So this is our first national army, 13,000 people, and they were escorted by George Washington and Alexander Hamilton to Pennsylvania to try to quell this disorder that was happening. And this was the first display of federal government ensuring that there is domestic tranquility and this uprising starts to stop. So they try to enforce the peace, so to speak. Jeffersonians, who were the Anti-Federalists, condemned this action as a brutal display of force by our national leaders and government and started gaining more followers. So a lot of people kind of erred on the side of the Whiskey Boys and saying that, oh, now national government's trying to control everything, and they're exerting their force on these people who are just trying to make money. And their money or their livelihood is being taken away from them by this excise tax. So this starts to create a division within the country, and our two-party political systems start to develop. So this is actually the start of the history of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, so to speak. Just a side note, George Washington was very, very opposed to political parties because he believed that they were a divisive measure that could only divide the country even more. So he was not a supporter of political parties, and I believe with his farewell address, he really, really emphasized that as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So again, the only thing you need to fill out with number 4 is the title, and Part D with domestic tranquility on your slide, the first slide on page 5. And we're going to move on. So if you flip back to page 3, again, I apologize if these are not in order. We'll talk about those first two political parties. So the first party was the Federalist, which we talked about before, and Alexander Hamilton was kind of the head of the Federalist party. And this emerged from the Federalists who supported the Constitution in 1780s. part of what they believed is that the elite should be the ones ruling, the people who are educated, the people who had money, and believed that government should be run by these people. They just trusted the common people to be able to have the gumption to take care of the things that are needed to be taken care of on the national level. They also believe that federal government should encourage businesses but not interfere with the dealings of businesses. So that was kind of part of Hamilton's 5-point plan with the import taxes, is not interfering and also supporting businesses but not interfering in what they do. So no government regulations on businesses, and this eventually will become an issue as we get to the late 1800s and early 1900s. Pro-British in policies, so they were still kind of supportive of the British in their foreign policy. So this was kind of very on the opposite end of the anti-federalists. So take a moment and fill in B, C, D, and E. All right, so we'll move on. So the second party that was created was the Jeffersonian Republicans. So this kind of evolved from the anti-federalist group that existed in the 1780s. So they advocated for rule of the people, by the people, and for the people. They believed that citizens should have a say in government. They also believed that people should be literate. And even those that weren't literate could be taught, okay? So any American had the ability to read and should be taught to read. And they also, this idea of kind of raising up the common people really appealed to the middle class, which existed of skilled laborers. So farmers, laborers, artisans, small shopkeepers, so small business owners were included in that as well. And this appealed to people who weren't part of the quote unquote elite group. They also believe that a government that governed best governed the least. So kind of a hands-off approach of national government. So letting us kind of do our thing, so to speak, as states, and a government that governs the best governs the least. They also believed in freedom of speech, that nobody should impede on those inherent rights of citizens. And with Jefferson and his really strong tie to France, was basically very pro-French in their beliefs and what they were taught. So if you could take a moment and fill in page D, E, and F, or numbers or letters D, E, and F on page 3. All right, so we'll go back to page 5 as our first test of foreign policy. So even after our revolution, there are a lot of things kind of going wrong in France. So if you remember back to global history, the French Revolution was a very, very brutal revolution. So anybody who did not support the Jacobins, who were a part of the monarchy that existed with King Louis and Queen Antoinette, anybody who was connected to the monarchy in any way in support of King Louis and Queen Antoinette, they would oftentimes be killed, usually by guillotine. So as you can see with the artistic interpretation on the left, that happened quite often. But this was our first test of kind of our foreign relationship with France. So French declared themselves a republic. But their carnage in terms of their revolution goes way beyond our Boston Massacre and way beyond our Boston Tea Party to a huge kind of carnage that existed in their country of kind of wiping out this elite class and replacing it with a body or a republic of the people. So it was very, very extreme in how they did it and went about it. Jeffersonians thought it was unfortunate, but they supported the people and believed that it was inevitable that the people would get tired of having authoritarian rule by the monarchy and wanted to establish their own government and kind of follow the suit of the Americans. But the Hamiltonians, so the Federalists, believed that it was frightening. So take a moment and think about why it would be so frightening for the people in federal government. Think back to what the Federalists really believed. And I'll ask you about this in class as well as we talk through this once more. And another question to consider is what happens in the United States if this kind of idealism spreads towards the United States? So we'll kind of attack that question as well. So take a moment and fill in under A with number 5, 1, and 2. So we'll go ahead and move on. So Washington's Neutrality Proclamation. So this dealt a lot with foreign policy. So if you flip to page 6, the slide should be on there with B. So Washington issued a neutrality proclamation in 1793. Now this idea of neutrality would exist till the Monroe Doctrine. And it would exist throughout part of the 1800s. So his idea was that the United States would be neutral. We wouldn't be involved in foreign affairs, especially since we're so fragile and we needed to kind of settle our country and become stronger. And he also warned that United States citizens should be impartial to both sides, meaning that they should hear out the issues on both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans. Jefferson was furious at George Washington that he did not consult Congress before passing this neutrality proclamation. But Hamilton kind of supported it, especially with the fear of what was happening in France is kind of trickling, especially amongst the elite party, and that this might inspire some action in the United States. So again, think about what could happen. So again, part of that was to make sure that things, at least in the United States, remain stable and ensuring, again, that domestic tranquility. So take a moment and fill in the 2 bullet points. So with Washington's farewell address, he actually was there for 2 terms, refused to run for a 3rd term. And this set the precedent for a limitation on presidential terms of only 8 years max. So only 2 terms could be served, and this set the precedent. And this is why a precedent. So this is why Washington is known as the precedent president. He sets the precedent or sets the tone for what other presidents after him will be able to do. So George Washington also was exhausted physically. This was a hard job on him. So even as you can see some of the American presidents we've had, how gray their hair turns after 1 term and even 2 terms. So looking at even Obama as he was elected in 2008 versus at the end of 2016, how gray his hair was in a span of only 8 years. So it's a very stressful job. It's a lot of pressure on a person. He was tired of the verbal abuse from Thomas Jefferson for becoming more partisan. So in his farewell address, he really kind of spoke to the evils of political parties. So he warned that political parties could become ultimately divisive to the people and citizens of the United States, and they cause divisions among the people. And he also warned of entangling alliances, so keeping alliances with countries like France that are in great turmoil. And if there is a civil disruption that occurs, we could get dragged into that issue. And we're a young country. We're very fragile as well. So is that something that we want to actually happen? He believed that isolationism should be the policy, that we should remain neutral, we should remain on our own, and this became the dominant foreign policy for the next 100 years. So literally until the end of the 1800s, we remained kind of in this neutral position and not kind of spreading ourselves throughout the entire world, but staying to ourselves. So we'll talk about this, especially later on as we go through our U.S. history course. So take a moment and fill in that information. So we'll actually do this in class, but start thinking about this now. So you don't have to do this now on a sheet of paper, but here's what I want you to start thinking about. George Washington does or does not deserve the top 5 ranking as one of the best presidents because. So give me some specific evidence that you've learned throughout this course on whether he deserves to be one of the top 5 or does not deserve to be one of the top 5. So I need at least 3 concrete pieces of evidence. So avoid glittering generalities because he was a very good leader and he stood his ground and he believed in the people. Give me specific evidence. So, okay, so what, where, when? Give me some specifics. So think about some times that we've talked about throughout this unit that demonstrate George Washington as a great leader or not as a great leader. It's your choice. Okay. So we'll talk about this next week. So that is it for our lecture. And we'll also talk about some of the best presidents and the complete list. We'll go through that as well on Monday in class.